I looked at this big piece of paper that had several generations on it, and there, for the first time in my life, in my 30s, it dawned on me that there was only one white person in my family, my mother. She had no branches. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew she had to be from somebody, somewhere. So I was living in New Jersey. I went to Buffalo and had my family all come together. My mom fixed our favorite dinner, and we were just sitting around visiting when I said to my family, you know that genealogy chart? They said, yeah. I said, you know, something is missing off that chart. And they all looked at me like I didn't have good sense. I said, Mama's white family is missing. And my mother made a sound like wind whistling through a crack in a door.
I'm Margaret Talcott, a director at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society and the curator of our author series. We're delighted to be one of the nonprofit organizations presenting this event along with the WGBH Forum Network. Tonight is especially meaningful as Dolores Johnson's story is at once a personal family history and a poignant account of racial discrimination in the United States. Before we could begin, just a few other introductions. First, from the State Library of Massachusetts, Beth.
I'm Beth Carroll Horrocks, the head of special collections at the State Library of Massachusetts. Our own author talk series was curtailed this spring because of coronavirus-related health concerns. So we're delighted. We are more than delighted to be able to collaborate for tonight's talk with American Ancestors NEHGS, with the Boston Public Library and the Museum of African American History.
Thank you, Beth. Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Kristen Motti, Adult Programs Librarian at the Boston Public Library. I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Lemerchi Frazier, who is from our co-sponsor, the Museum of African American History here in Boston. Lemerchi Frazier, a visual and performance artist, educator, and activist. She is a director of education at the Museum of African American History and an artist in the African American Master Artists in Residence program at Northeastern University. Lemerchi, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
And I am representing the Museum of African American History. We're so proud to share in this collaboration with WGBH Forum Network and our partners in this series of programs, American Stories, Inspiration Today. This program supports the history of written literature and discussion, especially tonight, that of concerns for and about Black people that affect us all in America. We are thrilled to hear the story of Dolores Johnson, author of many essays about race and identity. She is the daughter of a white mother and an African American father who fled to marry in Buffalo, New York, 24 years before the Supreme Court decision Loving versus Virginia struck down anti-interracial marriage in laws across the US. Her book, her very important book on the multi-generational family story that she presents, richly shared in her book, that subject of mixed race in Jim Crow and present day America, entitled Say I'm Dead, a family memoir of race, secrets, and love, can be yours. And own your own copy. It is a delightful treasure. Dolores allows us to touch the issues that we face today in our turbulent society. Her push through issues of Black women's experience of inequity in corporate America, issues of identity and cultural camouflage, and even the safety of her grandchild against experiencing police brutality. She reaches back to her family on a plantation in Alabama, finding her African roots, and forward through her examination of her white family to today's growing interracial family dynamics. After earning degrees from Howard University and Harvard Business School, and a career working for Fortune 500 companies, she began to do family research and found the entire missing white half of her family. In Say, I Am Dead, a family memoir of race, secrets, and love, she takes us on a journey of mystery, secrets, separation, and transformation. Here to read for us is Dolores Johnson.
Thank you so much, Limerci. And thank you to all the sponsors and all of you who have joined us here this evening. In the scene I'm about to read, my Black father and white mother tell us, their adult children for the very first time, how they did the unthinkable in 1942 Indianapolis. The Negro cabbie asked Ella twice if she was sure of the address, if she wanted the Black side of town. She assured him she did, and when the cab pulled up at his place, Charles was waiting on the sidewalk. As he helped her out, the cabbie turned all the way around to glare at Charles. "Man, why you want to mix me up in something like this?" "Just take the dollar," Charles said. "You haven't seen a thing. Understand?" She went into his room at the boarding house and sat on the nicked easy chair as Charles fixed the Coke she asked for, adding a splash of whiskey before pouring a straight one for himself. She raised her glass and made the toast the boys at her acting group taught her. "Here's to it and to it again. If you don't do it when you get to it, you'll never get to it to do it again." "Where did you learn something like that?" he asked. He liked the life in her eyes, the spirit in her soul. Without it, he realized, she would have never come over here to see him. Charles turned on the radio to a Moody Blues tune. Then a colored announcer came on. "Hey, all you cats out there, it's Saturday night. Get your best girl and cut a rug with us where the party keeps a-going all night long." He pulled her up to dance, though she protested that she wasn't much good. Ella Fitzgerald was on, and while they tried, neither could follow what the other was doing. She knew the foxtrot with its set patterns, and he knew the country mule. They laughed through false turns and stepping on each other's toes. But when a slow tune came on, they did better. Charles folded her into his chest, and she followed his simple steps. In no time, they were cooking dinner together at his place a couple of nights a week. But as they grew into love, Charles began to worry. He didn't think she understood the trouble she could get in for being with him. Did this white girl even know she could be attacked in the street for it? Did she have any idea of what she could face for breaking the unwritten Jim Crow code? Some of the Indianapolis and Marion County elected officials were open members of the Klan. They posed as good guys, doing community service like giving away wheelchairs and food to whites only. But did Ella understand that the Grand Wizard, a man named Stevenson, used to run the nationwide Ku Klux Klan from Indianapolis? That they hated Negroes so much that they terrorized and killed them? She didn't. 2 Negro men got lynched in Marion, Indiana, a few years before he and Ella took up. After a robbery and murder, a white woman claimed rape. The suspected men were locked up briefly until a white mob broke into the jail with sledgehammers and strung them up. Charles saw a picture postcard of the lynching, taped up next to the price list in the black barber shop. On it, a big crowd of men and women milled around the brown bodies hanging from trees, their white faces satisfied. The victims' heads bent over their nooses where their necks had broken, their limp legs dangling free. Their bodies were left on display as whites congratulated themselves on delivering vigilante justice. "That was the proof," the man said in the next barber's chair said to Charles, "of how the Klan was the law in Indianapolis. Don't take no chances in these parts," he said. Nobody has been called to account. As happened at many lynchings, studio photographers shot a ghastly picture, then sold thousands of copies, like circus souvenirs, to white people who wanted a keepsake. Charles sat Ella down to explain how it was. Somebody could get the law on him because of their relationship, trump up the charges, beat him up, throw him in jail, or lynch him for touching a white woman, and nobody would do a thing about it, like what happened to those boys. He was getting pretty scared, and she should be too. Ella had to understand that, for her part, the place where they both worked would fire her if they found out. It would be a scandal, and all the white people would turn their backs on her. My brother David wiped his brow with the handkerchief he always carried and asked incredulously, "You mean this was the first time you had heard any of this, Mama? How could you not know?" My life had only been in a white community up to then. I was completely sheltered, Mama said, from that kind of thing. Negro business wasn't my business, nor anyone's I knew. My family didn't follow politics or race, and even if they had, a lynching wasn't anything to talk to a young lady about. When your father explained all this to me, I had only the slightest idea. Charles wanted Ella to think these risks through before they saw each other again. She had to decide if the risks were worth it. Could she live with her family never knowing about them? To staying alert all the time so they never made that one mistake that would ruin their lives? He took Ella by the shoulders and finally said he loved her so much he was willing to face those dangers. Charles's forehead sweat and his voice dropped deep with desperation when he said he had to be sure she loved him the same way. He pulled her close and stroked her thick curls. "Take some time to think hard before you answer me," he said. "I mean it. And if you don't come back, I'll understand."
Wow. Thank you so much for that reading, Dolores.
You're welcome.
How very interesting. And it poses so many questions as you read that and how it relates to today. You state that your mother had known anything about the consequences of interracial marriage. And you explained that as you were going through what you wrote there, that in her family and community, Negro business wasn't their business. And what I'd like to ask you is, how does that relate to white people in today's racial reckoning, who now claim to want to understand the Black experience? Can you draw some parallels for us here?
That's a really interesting question, Lamerchi, because to my mind, it seems to be the same conversation from 1942 to 2020, where white people are living in white communities without relations with Black people, and so have very little understanding about the Black experience. It's a shame that in all of those years, we haven't had more mingling on a substantial level in order to let people be aware of how the other side lives and what they experience. I think that's a really important point for today, when we now have a racial reckoning and people are asking, well, how can I know more? How can I understand? What should I say? What should I do? And the solution to that, in my opinion, is that we do need to come together on a more substantial basis in housing, in jobs, and even in marriage.
Mm-hmm. Well, what exactly did your parents think they were up against legally? And the word comes up, miscegenation or anti-miscegenation. Can you explain that term for us, for our audience and me, to understand more about how the legalities of marrying interracially at the time that they married was really on the plate to be considered, but really not allowed. Could you explain that?
I will. The word miscegenation means mixing. And originally in the state of Virginia, the first statute was put on the books forbidding intermarriage with white people. That applied to Blacks and Native Americans. Before 1800, most of the southern parts of the United States had adopted similar statutes. Those are anti-miscegenation laws. The interesting thing about my parents' situation is that they were in Indiana, which is a northern state. And many people don't realize that some of the same racist principles that were going on in the South were also going on in the North. And so the laws from state to state had severe punishments for anybody who dared enter into a mixed race situation. You didn't even have to be married to get into this kind of trouble, but the Klan was very diligently persecuting anybody, especially the Black men that got involved in these relationships. And so should you be in a state where it was against the law, the penalty was usually at least 7 years in prison at hard labor for both the woman and the man. Those laws stayed on the book in up to, at one time we had 28 states in the United States that had anti-miscegenation laws. And then in 1967, there were still 16 remaining states that had anti-miscegenation laws. There was a couple in Virginia called Lovings. Last name was Loving. They went across the line into the District of Columbia and got married legally and then returned home to take up housekeeping in Virginia. Their home was broken into in the middle of the night by the police, who arrested them. And the judge in their case offered them a choice. They could be banned from Virginia for 25 years, or they could go to jail. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It's a famous case, the Loving v. Virginia decision by the Supreme Court overturned all remaining anti-miscegenation laws in the United States. That was 1967. My parents married in 1942, almost 25 years before those laws were abolished.
And you've indicated that your parents fled to New York in secret to marry and to marry legally. So New York must have been one of those states where this was possible. So they must have been aware of having to do that. Please.
They decided to go to New York after my father gave my mom that talking to about what they really were up against. The Klan and the council, the lynching of 2 Black men in the same area where they lived, and the anti-miscegenation laws in Indiana. He convinced her that they had to leave the state in secret and that her family couldn't know anything about where they were. Otherwise, her mom, who certainly would have been dead set against such a union, would have sent the law after them. And so without telling her family that she was going to marry this man, she said she was going on a vacation. She created her own disappearance, and they put her on a plane, on a train, and wished her a good vacation to go visit her girlfriend in Massachusetts. And my mother disappeared into thin air. Later, when I became acquainted with my white family, they told me that when she disappeared, the FBI got involved in the search for her because she had traveled across so many states on that train. And she'd sent a postcard home from New York City, where she transferred and went on a different train up to Buffalo, New York. And so all the authorities in Indianapolis, Massachusetts, the states in between, and New York City thought she must have been in New York City when she disappeared. And after searching for her there, they had no body and they had no evidence. She had vanished. She was in Buffalo marrying my father legally in New York State. But the police called her grandfather in. He came from Indiana over to New York to help with the search. And when they decided to close the case, they told him, this case is being closed and labeled a victim of foul play, which meant that she had either been murdered or sold into white slavery. And that is what her family lived with for decades. This is the price that people paid to be intermarried in the 40s. This is something that is important for people to understand, that when we see mixed couples today and we don't have all of the backlash that used to go on, that is an opportunity that was gained through the sacrifice of people like my parents.
Thank you so much. Now you talk about the relationship of Ella to her family. How about your father and his family? How did this marriage change his relationship, or did it?
My grandmother, my father's mother, took the couple to her minister, who was the head of the NAACP in Buffalo, to have them married. And she told my mother she was going to teach her how to cook soul food, and that she would be her mama now, since she had run off from her own family. And she was really an anchor for them in this new situation. When a cousin was having a big birthday party, my mother was anxious to go because she didn't know anybody in town and she wanted to get out. She wanted to have some fun. And my grandmother kept trying to talk her down, but she wanted to go so bad, they went. And when they arrived, she came into a party. They lived in the ghetto. The party was in the ghetto. All the guests were Black except her, and people were aghast. They were all watching her and commenting, what is she doing here? What does she want to do here? Most of them had never had a white person in their house. And there was an uncle who was a very forceful personality, and he was in the kitchen. He had been making the barbecue, and he was in there bragging about his barbecue sauce. And when my father brought my mother back there to introduce her to his uncle, the uncle got very upset about him bringing her there. And there were words, and an almost fist fight broke out. And my grandmother stood between her son and her brother, telling them to stop this, stop it, because she had already told them beforehand, Charles is coming with his new white wife. You all greet her and welcome her. She's a member, legal member of this family. And yet people were very torn, because the feeling was, oh my God, here is a white girl that has run off with a Black man, and we know the law must be after her. We don't want anything to do with this. They were afraid. And so they split, the family split as to who would have a cup of coffee with my mother and who wouldn't. And that went on for a very long time, until my grandmother got them all in varying degrees in the boat.
Do you think it was possible that there were people who did not care about race in the 1950s in Buffalo? And can you tell us, what is the Clique Club, and how did that present scenarios for your mother and father to interact with other people in Buffalo?
My mom wanted my oldest brother to go to Catholic school, as she had. And when she took him there to enroll him, she saw another white woman with a brown child. After 6 years of not really having any friends, this woman invited her home for a cup of coffee because they had something in common. And when she went there, she met 2 other white women who were also married to Black men. And they were involved in a group called the Clique Club. This was a group of people. Many of the white women were married to black jazz men who played at a club called the Moonglow. And they practiced at the historic Colored Musicians Club in Buffalo, where people like Count Basie would come and sit in with them. Other women that were involved in this club were the dressmakers and the dancers in the show. And what they said to me as I went around to interview people for this book was we didn't care anything about race because we were in show business, and the only thing that counts is whether you've got the same groove and you can make a show together that really works. And so there were people even in the dance group that had continuing lines of show business people, and that was Rick James, the Super Freak Grammy winner. His mother, Betty James, was in the dance review at the Moonglow. She's not in this picture, but my mother is the third person from the left, and these other women were part of the club. This gave my family a cocoon where we could relax and be ourselves without the public scorn that we often faced. We would go out and have people scuttle their children over into a corner so they wouldn't touch us. We were called names all the time. My oldest brother was hit in the head with a 2x4 that had a rusted nail by another kid down the street, a black kid who said he did it because my brother looked so white. We had lots and lots of difficulty in public, but the Clique Club kids, about 15 of us, we all grew up together with the other black kids that were in the group. There were no pure white kids in the group, but we had a made family that enjoyed our social lives together. And these were our Christmas guests and our birthday party people, and the ones that my mom always had coffee with. This was our made family.
Your book title is a curious one, Say I'm Dead. And I'd just like you to, if you will, explain for us what prompted you, what inspired you to take that title on for your story.
Say I'm Dead comes from something my mother said. Once I had done my father's genealogy, tracing his black roots back through the South with the old people down there, I looked at this big piece of paper that had several generations on it, and there, for the first time in my life, in my 30s, it dawned on me that there was only one white person in my family, my mother. She had no branches. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew she had to be from somebody, somewhere. So I was living in New Jersey. I went to Buffalo and had my family all come together. My mom fixed our favorite dinner, and we were just sitting around visiting when I said to my family, you know that genealogy chart? They said, yeah. I said, you know, something is missing off that chart. And they all looked at me like I didn't have good sense. I said, Mama's white family is missing. And my mother made a sound like wind whistling through a crack in a door. My father snapped his suspenders and said, oh, Lord. So my mother was very, very unhappy with me bringing this up. It was a 36-year-old secret. She had never spoken about her family. We didn't know anything about them. We didn't know where they were. But I said, you know, I am really rattled by not knowing half of my family story, and I need to know. I think everybody wants to know, and that's why Ancestry has, 30 million people searching their roots on there too. But after talking a long time, I had two brothers. One, David, was a black militant who wore a dashiki all the time and had an afro the size of a pumpkin. And my oldest brother, Charles Nathan, had married a white girl and they lived on the white side of town. We saw them from time to time, but there was always a suspicion that he was doing some kind of passing. And everybody had a different opinion, but it was pretty much of an uproar when I started this conversation. My father took my mother upstairs and we could hear her crying and him talking. And when they came back downstairs, they stood there very stiffly. And my mother said, well, okay, we're going to tell you now since you're adults. I ran away from my family to marry your father. And I didn't mean for them to ever find me. And they haven't. She was so defiant about it. But we sat down and we talked further. And finally I said, you know, give me some details about these people. I'd like to go and see whose blood is running in my veins. I just want to know. And my mother wanted no part of it. She was really upset with me. She said, finally, if you are going to do this, you have to leave me out of it because I could never face my family again after what I did. It's been 36 years and they must think I'm dead. I don't want to face them. I said, well, okay, I can go out there and just find out for myself and I won't involve you, but tell me, what am I supposed to say about you? And she hesitated. She was almost shaking. She said, you'll have to say I'm dead. That's the title.
Wow. That's so very interesting how that has been her journey and your father's journey. But now I'd like to ask you more about your own journey as you were impacted by the decisions that your parents made, and your brothers, you explained, took their own journeys in different ways. In terms of your professional life and living in a Jim Crow America at the time, what would you tell us about how it impacted you in the business world? I remember reading in your book in the chapter called Code Switch, which is extremely interesting, that you didn't want to look like an angry Black woman. So in that respect, as you talk about you're facing the world in this skin that you have, what was that like for you?
Well, interestingly enough, I had graduated from Harvard Business School, one of the first 10 Black women to go through there. And I landed a job as an executive at AT&T headquarters. However, I was fully qualified for whatever they had for me to do, but I had a hard time getting the white men to pay any attention to what I was saying. And I think that's partly by being Black and partly by being a woman in 1970. That's what we faced. I quickly began to discuss this with my husband, who also had a professional position, about how we could be more effective, more respected, be able to climb the corporate ladder like the others did. And so we practiced at home. If there was a presentation the next day, we would go over it for one another and sort of say, well, maybe don't say it that way, don't use that word, or don't laugh too loudly, or be sure you filter out all the ebonics. Filter, hesitate, consider what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. Try to make them see you as an equal, because they wouldn't see us as an equal if we brought our whole self to work. And that took me into a study, as I had already begun to study at Harvard. What were the code words? What were the jargon in the business world? What were the ways to deflect conflict, which battles to pick and which ones to let go. And it became a second job. I believe that this still goes on in corporate America and many organizations where Black people go to work fully qualified, but can be discounted for their cultural ways. They have to, if they want to get people to pay attention and give them every opportunity, they have to learn to code switch. And I call it in my book, putting on my white mask to go to work. After 40 years as an executive, I became so accustomed to code switching that it wasn't the work that it was in the beginning, but it was a lot of hours and a lot of filtering in real time in order to come to the table and have my place respected.
Yes, and you describe it as like a bad romance, and that it was infuriating and exhausting. So after arriving at the decisions to code switch, to keep your executive persona separate from that of family, did you find any other effects that reflected in your social life and your entertainment life? And did that change in any way as you progressed through your executive persona?
Well, in the beginning, I would say that our social life was mostly with Black people. We were at a Black Baptist church and with our Black family and so on. Yet we bought a house in a white suburb, mostly because we could afford it in that particular place, and the property values were going up. We had learned something about saving and investing and growing some wealth. But then we started to socialize also with colleagues and white neighbors. And we began to go to the opera, Metropolitan Opera in New York City with white folks, and we had Thanksgiving with white folks and so forth. And after a time, I had to ask myself, are you a little bit too far over the line from your roots? Do you need to really pay attention here and adjust what's happening? Because I've always been a soul sister at the heart. And I didn't want to lose that. And I didn't want to be overly influenced by white culture. I wanted to be able to be conversant with and participate in white culture, but I didn't want to have that be my only culture. And that really was what started my search for my family roots. At that point, to bring myself back to center, I decided to go and do the root search of my father's Black family.
Okay. And with that, can you explain to us, as your mother began to, I guess, reunite with her family, that process of reunion with her sister, that's indicative of the next slide that is available to us. Can you explain something about what that proved to you, or what that impacted in your own sense of being and your own identity?
Yes, well, it took some doing, but after I met my white family, I was able to reunite my mother and her sister. But it was a process. Not so much for my aunt and her family, who welcomed us, surprisingly welcomed us there in Indiana, in that place where they had to run from. They said that family was much more important than race. And so we were able to reunite fully on both sides of the family. But before that could happen, I had to face myself. I had started this, and yet I had never thought it through as to what would happen. I first thought I would just go and see these people, and that would be it. But my mom and her sister were so elated to find each other again at this point in life that the relationship developed. But in the days when we were just getting acquainted, I had to face what I call my boogeyman. Because in growing up, there had been so many incidents of racial discrimination that the boogeyman told me, white people are out to get you. You don't trust them. You don't really open yourself up to white people because they're going to hurt you if they can. That started when I was 4 years old, when I fell against the pot-bellied stove that heated our flat, and the white cab company who promised to come and take me to the emergency room left us standing on the sidewalk. Or when my guidance counselor in high school told me I wasn't to go to college, even though I was in all honors and AP classes, because I was colored, that I should go and take up sewing instead. The cross that was burned on my husband's and my lawn in Louisiana threatened our life because we bought a house. My father was unable to rent us a decent apartment because the people slammed the door in his face and said, "No niggers here." All of this accumulation and much more I could describe made me believe my boogeyman. And I knew that accepting my white family fully meant I had to put the boogeyman out. And that was a reckoning. That was a reckoning. But my aunt and her family proved to be the decent, loving white people that my mother had always shown me could be.
Now, you did go down to Alabama after seeing the movie Roots to meet your father's descendant, or people who he descended from in Alabama. And can you tell us something about your great aunt Willie?
Great Aunt Willie was someone I had never met, but I had written her many letters for my illiterate grandmother over the years. And she was maybe one of the oldest relatives in that line, still living. And so I went down to Birmingham and we sat on her veranda drinking sweet tea, trying to get acquainted. And I told her that I really wanted to understand more about the family. And Aunt Willie, being all the way across the country, all those years from my family, didn't know what I knew and didn't know. And so she told me a lot of stories I hadn't expected to find when I went down there. In one case, we pulled out this dress box from under her bed that was covered in dust and wiped it down and took it to the dining room table, and we started looking at photographs and laying them out, who was related to who and married to who and who was whose father, and the story started to come together. And she came across a picture of my grandmother. And she said, "Look at that. The two of you are spitting images. That's because, you know, you both have that white side." And I said, "Well, what's white side?" She said, "You know your grandmother's half white, right?" And I said, "No, I've never heard of that." She said, "Well, you know, her mom, your great-grandmother, Frances, was raped on a plantation by a white man repeatedly. She was just ripe, you know, maybe 14 or 15 years old. And the issue of that was your grandmother." And I said, "Well, she must have been ashamed my grandmother didn't tell me because she was ashamed." And Aunt Willie was, no, she said, "What would she have to be ashamed about? That's just what white men could do to Black women anytime they felt like it. And nobody did a thing about it." So when I got home, I asked my grandmother, "Tell me about your mother, Frances, and why haven't you told me this story?" She said, "Look, that white man was no father to me. I don't claim him. Once in a blue moon, he would come around where I was raised and sit on the porch with a little bag of candy He put me on his knee. But when he crossed over that porch, we all knew we were never to acknowledge that he had anything to do with us. So no, there was nothing to tell you.
So I think that that revelation brings us to a point where we can now ask for the questions from the audience. Before we do that, I'd like to say that what you have shared with us is so important to what is happening in America today. And the questions that have come from the audience absolutely indicate that that is so. Some of the questions that I would like to ask you here, one of them says, do you think the color line will ever be erased?
Well, I'd like to say yes, but I don't think I can. I think that American history is so rooted in racism that to think that it could be totally erased from the deep biases that people have absorbed for so long is a stretch. But what I will say is that I think we are inching forward. And I say that looking at the trajectory of race relations in America. When we look at the civil rights demonstrations, that huge outcry resulted in significant changes for African Americans. Didn't erase the color line, but there was progress. And then we look at the various other changes that have happened. Even when I was in the corporate America, there was affirmative action, which people always try to make out to be a bad thing, but it was the way the government made sure that employers took qualified people like myself and gave them the job they were qualified to do. And I think that's helped with the rise of a Black middle class. From there, we look at something like the George Floyd racial reckoning, and we see that people are now not only looking at changing the brutal police practices and policies that exist, but looking more broadly at other inequalities and mistreatment that Black people face. I expect that we are going to move forward another significant step as a result of that. But the erasure of the color line is so far in the future. Erasure is something I can't quite see.
Okay, so do you identify as biracial? I know it's a binary kind of question with Black and white, and there may be other mixtures, but in terms of your own identity, how do you relate to that kind of a question? Many times we hear the term high yellow, and it is a common occurrence sometimes when there is a person of lighter hue who is Black to say, hey, light skin, could you talk to me? Those kinds of references bring in that question of identity and the complexity of identity. Can you tell us about your own take on that?
Well, it's true that there are very many shades within the Black race, from chalk to charcoal. And that comes from the origins of mixed race in this country, which is slavery. After the import of further slaves was abolished in 1820, the way that the slave population grew and magnified was through the rape of the Black female slave by the masters. In the census records, the federal government split hairs on portions of mixed race by identifying people as mulattoes, half Black, half white, quadroons, 1/4 white, octoroons, 1/8 white, all in an effort to identify the other from the pure white race. And so this history of colorism, even in the United States, and the sanctity of the white purity has permeated our society. And yes, I've been called half-breed, Oreo, high yellow, red bone, sellout, and so forth because of the way I look. But I was raised as a Black person. I went to Howard University, which was an amazing experience that steeped me in Afrocentric thought and a lifelong ordering of my steps around raising the Black race. I married a Black man, I have a Black daughter, and I am a member of the Black church. And so I'm still a Black person, even though I have a white mother. But when people ask me this question, because biracial is a term that is coming up more commonly, especially with people who are, say, teens and college-age people, I respond that I am an African-American biracial. Because, you know, we have Chinese biracials, we have Filipina biracials, we have Indian biracials, so African-American biracial.
In your book, Leaning Brown, that chapter, you speak about your daughter, Jennifer, and her travels in the world and her own complex issue with identity, her marriage, and then her son, and the conversation about warning your grandson about how to survive in America that does have police brutality based on this racial, is structural racism within the country. Can you speak to that and what that does for you as a grandmother of a child who may be affected by this?
First, I want to say that my daughter lived a very different life than I did, because by the time she was born, I was already a corporate executive, as opposed to my childhood growing up with parents who had 6th and 9th grade educations, and we were lower class. She had a white family when she was born. Her white grandmother, my mother, came and helped me with her after my husband died, and I was left a single parent of a 5-year-old. She grew up around white people. However, Jennifer certainly has faced the question of discrimination. And now she has a white husband and a biracial child. And the first thing that we talked very seriously about while she was pregnant was how they are going to educate that boy about the assault on the Black body in America, the discrimination he will certainly face, and how Black Lives Matter affects him, even though he's colored like I am, same kind of coloring. He will not escape racism. None of us do.
Okay. Well, the audience is excited about your comments and your narrative. One of the comments says, outstanding presentation, riveting narrative. Dolores' story belongs to all of us. And another comment, thanks so much for sharing your fantastic and moving family history. And now we would just like you to, if you will, read another section of your book before we close the program and acknowledge the other partners.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now for my second reading, and I'm going to make a final comment. After reuniting with our white family, I decided to dig around into the history of my white side and see if I could fill out the genealogy. So this scene starts there. I'd only found a couple of generations back on my white side with bloodlines in Great Britain. That was not nearly as much information as there was on my Black side. But what I did find was that my discovered whiteness, adopted and related, was so much more privileged and freer than I or my Black family had had. My maternal white grandmother was raised by a striving craftsman who chose to immigrate to America for a better life. He built his trade freely in the late 1800s, while my Black sharecropper great-grandmother was being raped by a white man on the same plantation where our ancestors were slaves. My maternal great-grandfather, born in 1852, was a banker in Ohio when my Blacks were slaves in Smithville, Georgia. They lived in a fancy home where the family status made them look down on other whites. My white grandfather, Lewis, was a self-made electrician hired to help wire up the Indianapolis Speedway for its opening, while my half-Black grandmother had to escape north from the feared violence by all classes of whites for the least of reasons. Yet the kind of opportunity privilege my white people had didn't flow to me through my white mother. She gave it all up and became a sort of white woman for the love of a Black man. And that left me to grow up never knowing what those opportunities could have meant in my youth. So in my closing comment, let me suggest that the audience think about this kind of income disparity and opportunity privilege that happened not only in my mixed race family, but in nearly all African American families. Consider how my mixed race family's background provides a window into how economic inequality has accumulated through our country's generation after generation after generation for hundreds of years. That's how the Boston Globe was able to report 2 years ago that the average net worth of African American families in Boston was just $8 compared to the average net worth of Boston white families at over $240,000. So I leave you with that thought, and thank you so much for having me this evening.
Thank you so much, Dolores, for your comments, your answers. You've given us much to think about, and we want to absolutely encourage people to join us in purchasing your book. We want to join with the partners that made this possible to say thank you so much for being with us on behalf of the Museum of African American History, that in addition to our archives of about 5,000 volumes of books by Black authors and telling the story of Black authors, we have events and a museum for you to visit, for you to take part in and come and see us. Our events will be announced at www.maah.org.
Well, thank you, Dolores, and thank you, Lamerchi. I think we all learned a lot from this book. To find out more about the State Library, you can just type into your browser a simplified version of our website, which is mass.gov/LIB, and that will take you right to our homepage. So thank you all.
For upcoming programs at the Boston Public Library, please visit bpl.org. We've got books and more, and you can learn about new experiences as we're reopening. And also, if you need reading ideas, upcoming programs for all ages, please check www.bpl.org. Margaret, over to you.
We at American Ancestors NEHGS are honored to be part of this event, working with such important and amazing American stories, such fine partners and people. We want all of you to know that our doors, our virtual doors, are wide open to anyone who wants to research their family history, hidden or unhidden. You can connect with our library and genealogists on the phone, over Twitter, or through our website, AmericanAncestors.org, where you'll also find downloadable free research guides and other resources accessed specifically for these type of events. We've collected all of our vast resources for African American history under AmericanAncestors.org/specials/African American ancestry. Our mission remains, even in these strange and challenging times, to educate and inspire and connect people. For now, though, we wish all of you out there a safe and an inspirational evening. We thank you for joining us in these last remarkable days of what has been a truly historic summer on so many levels. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you, and we wish you all a very, very good night. Thank you, Dolores, and thank you, Lamerchi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.